Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. I'm Jonathan Capehart, associate editor at the Washington Post. Well, the 2024 election happened and Donald Trump, the 45th president of the United States, was elected the 47th president of the United States. Joining me now, Michael Scher, Washington Post national political reporter. Michael, welcome back to First Look.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan.
So you and several of our Post colleagues published a fascinating behind-the-scenes account of the 2024 presidential race. So, Michael, what happened in America on Tuesday?
I think it's going to actually take a while to figure out. I mean, I can tell you what happened behind the scenes. I can't tell you which of those things led to a result as dramatic as this one. We went from a 3-point popular vote victory for Democrats to, at least right now, the counting's still going on, a 3-point win for Trump. We spent a year telling everyone almost every day, this is a very closely divided country. This is a margin of error race. This wasn't really a margin of error result. This was a dramatic swing across the country, blue states swinging in some cases nearly double digits or double digits, 3-point swings in the states where Democrats were clearly outspending, both in the field operation and advertising Republicans. I could tick off some of the things that may have had a role, but honestly, I think it's still going to be a while to know, which of these was decisive. It's clear that Donald Trump ran a far more disciplined campaign. It's for the first time in 3 races. He had a unified campaign team who came to him with one opinion almost always. And he tried to mess with that at several points during the cycle, bringing in other people, but they were able to basically restore order. That had a huge impact because, one of the untold stories of 2016 and 2020 is that despite the result, there was a lot of unforced errors by Trump over the course of that campaign. And the number of unforced errors this time is far smaller. I think obviously Democrats have a real brand issue right now. It's not just tactics. They won on tactics. They were outspending. They ran a campaign with a new candidate and 107 days to go. But the American people just really weren't buying what they were selling. The sort of frame that Kamala Harris ran in, which was a derivative of the 2008 Obama frame, a sort of hope and change, economic middle class message. I think there's going to be a lot of soul searching going forward because I think Democrats are dealing with a situation in which the customer is just not buying anymore what they're selling. They don't believe that they're going to deliver the sort of change they're promising to deliver.
I want to go back to what you were just talking about in terms of the Trump campaign being disciplined, how he tried to mess with it, but the people who were there restored order. And it made me, made me think of Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles. So we're going to do a little detour here. Yesterday, President-elect Trump announced that Susie Wiles will be his chief of staff. Can you just tell our audience the significance of that selection and having that be his first selection?
I've covered Trump since 2015 very closely, and even before that. I don't think there's ever been a top aide to the president who has so delicately and deftly managed him in a way that made him feel empowered and made him feel well served throughout. The problem with Trump is, if you're a staffer to him, is he takes advice. He's very transactional in every moment. He's constantly changing his mind. But when things get bad, he tends to lash out. And what Susie Wiles, a former Florida Republican operative, found a way to do was to convince Trump that she was letting him be himself, and she was in many cases, and that she had his interests at heart at all times, and was able to sort of steer him. And I think the fact that she's going to be chief of staff in the White House suggests that, and I don't want to predict with Trump, but suggests that we may have a slightly more stable transition and first 100 days than we had in 2016. If you remember then, Trump didn't trust most of the people around him. They were fighting with each other. We went through a series of chiefs of staff. We know now that multiple chiefs of staff were very skeptical of the president they were working for at the time. I think Susie's a different category. She understands who Trump is, but she's able to convince him that she is serving him and keep him rowing more in a straight line than I think he's ever done in his political career.
Okay, so now we're back on track. But thank you for that Michael, because it's important for people to understand who she is and where she fits in the Trump orbit. In the piece on the behind the scenes look, you wrote about a critical decision Trump made to oppose a national abortion ban. How did he come to that decision?
I think he was leaning this way in some respects throughout the primary. I mean, he didn't want to. He warned very often pro-life audiences or anti-abortion audiences that they had to be politically smart going forward now that Roe had been overturned. But there was a moment in the general election after he had secured the nomination where it was not clear whether he was going to come out in favor of a federal abortion ban. He had supported a 20-week ban during his first term as president. There were advisors around him, including Kellyanne Conway, his former campaign manager, anti-abortion activists who were saying a 15-week ban is a common sense, bare minimum standard. And going back to the Susie point, Susie put together a presentation and more importantly, a unified campaign team to present to him on the plane to Michigan one day why any embrace of a federal abortion ban would be damaging to him. And essentially, the argument was this: some of these states don't yet have 15-week bans, and you need to win people who want to have access to abortion beyond 15 weeks. And so, if you come out in favor of this, you're going to lose votes, and it's going to possibly cost you the election. Trump was convinced, and there are a number of instances through his campaign where that sort of thing happened. It wasn't just who whispered to him last. It was an organized presentation with data, with a united front. And the president made, I think, what everyone will agree is the right political decision.
Let's talk about Vice President Harris. You also write about the meeting between senior Biden aides that led to President Biden's decision to drop out of the 2024 race. Talk about that and how the election was transformed when it became a Trump-Harris campaign.
Yeah, so this was a meeting actually the Thursday before President Biden announced he was dropping out July 21st. And it was a meeting of the campaign pollsters. And what was interesting about this is that Biden and his senior team at the White House, Mike Donnell and Steve Ricchetti, had never had good relationships with their pollsters. That was true in 2020. It was true in 2024. Biden had never met with the pollsters. There wasn't a lot of polling conducted. The Biden team view was polling is often misleading. It's myopic. It answers whatever question you're asking it, but it doesn't tell you what's really going on in the country, and it can't really be trusted. And by that point in July, there was enormous frustration in the Democratic Party, obviously, but also within the campaign that the president may not be getting the message of just how bad his situation was. The pollsters met with the senior staff at the White House, some of them on Zoom, and afterwards, one of the Biden advisors was angry and said that that was unprofessional. Your job is to tell the president how to win, not whether to win. Regardless, he was out of the race 3 days later. The writing was sort of on the wall at that point, and he put Kamala Harris in a very difficult position. Now, the headlines for that first month were incredibly positive, up 5-6 points in the polls, basically an even race. Again, $1 billion in a little more than a month of fundraising. I mean, it was a huge sea change for the Democratic operation. But I think we now know that that those advances from where Biden was masked deeper weaknesses. Harris wasn't able to fully introduce herself to all of the voters she needed to. The Trump campaign was able to actually raise serious questions about who she was, and I don't think there was ever a point where the independent voter, the swing voter, who polling said was really deciding this based on the economy, their frustration with inflation, their frustration over the last few years. She was never able to make the sale to them. There's a debate. It's almost like a religious doctrinal debate right now going on in the Democratic Party about, would have been better for her more time, less time, what could have been done different. But I mean, at this point, it's sort of like saying the special teams team, blew a football game that's lost 30-4 or 30-6. It just is not. It just is. It misses sort of the forest for the trees, I think.
Yeah, some part of me wonders if um, anyone heard anything that she said in terms of her plans for the economy and America's leadership role in the world. But one more question for you, Michael. The Harris campaign kept a somewhat hands-off approach during the campaign when it came to President Biden, right down to not even mentioning his name at a rally in Scranton, his home, his hometown. So did the Harris campaign use the president effectively, or were they afraid to use him because of his unfavorables?
Yeah, I think two things were going on there. I think one of, and you could argue, the weaknesses of Harris during this campaign was an enormous personal loyalty to Biden. She was very resistant to ever doing anything that would show distance with him. That was an ongoing conversation inside the campaign of whether she should be more aggressive there. She wasn't the same politician. It was clear that he was not a popular president. The wrong track numbers were incredibly high. And so that was sort of a drama that continued throughout. We were told that after that View appearance where Kamala Harris sort of miffed a question about what she would have done different, that there had been preparation for a question like that, and that in the moment, what aids to her thought was she had just frozen up because she didn't want to be saying something negative about him. And I think if she had answered the question differently, it wouldn't have had to be very critical of him. It just would have been an affirmative case that I'm a very different politician. I'm a younger politician. I have these plans. He didn't have these plans going forward. At least you would have not had, the tens of millions of dollars in Trump advertising that used the clips from The View spent against her. On the flip side, I think if you believe the polling, and again, this is debated, especially within Biden's orbit, Biden did not help her as a messenger. There were a number of flubs late in the game from the president that were distracting, most notably the garbage comment he made, which stepped on Harris's final rally. But also, we got polling from Future Forward, the largest outside group, and they immediately tested a number of messages from Harris, like within 5 days of her taking over the nomination. And they wrote in a memo that was shared with the campaign uh, quietly, privately. It was posted on a website that no one else knew about. That of all the messages they tested from Harris, mentioning of Biden was the worst performing one. It was not what voters wanted to hear. By the time Biden got out, the voters they needed to win were sick of Biden. They wanted to turn the page.
Excuse me. I'm sorry. The weather here, I don't know about you, Michael, but the weather here has been so warm that the cherry blossoms are blooming again, other flowers are blooming again, and so my allergies are bananas. But excuse me, the
Morning in
last
America.
seriously. One more question for you, specifically on the vice president not putting distance between her and the president. Politically speaking, how could she, I'm just wondering, how could she put distance between herself and the president when she is still a part of the administration? How can she run against the Biden-Harris administration when she is the Biden-Harris administration? Was she between a rock and a hard place, politically speaking, do you think?
Oh yeah, definitely she was between a rock and a hard place. I think though, you can massage your way through a rock and a hard place. So it's not like it was a hopeless task.
Right.
And I don't think many would argue that she did an ideal job of splitting that difference. I think, there was this debate I referenced within the campaign about whether she should be more aggressive here. The calculation there was if she took a harsher stand, maybe on how to handle Israel and the Gaza war, or maybe on, one program or another, there would be a cost. But the question was whether that cost among the base that supported Biden would be made up for by her reclaiming something she lost at the end, this sort of change mantle. It's a change election. I don't think voters saw her as change when they went to the polls. So that was one thing. I think the answer is, and I don't have the words for her of how to do that, but the answer is, not to dwell on what he did wrong. It's to make clear in your speeches and when you're asked the question why you would be different going forward and why you have different plans and how you differ. What does it matter that you're 30 years younger? Does it matter that you have a different life experience. Does it matter that you have, I mean, they had a bunch of new policy proposals that were not the president's policy proposals in the first 2 weeks. She never really cast those proposals as distinct from Biden. She just cast them as her own proposal. She could have said,
Mm.
"Look, I'm doing more on housing because not enough was done on housing in the last few years. I'm going to do more on immigration because not enough was done on immigration." And there's a way of splitting that difference. And in the end, she didn't really go there at all. And I think that's one of the criticisms. Again, I don't know if you can say any of these tactical questions cost her the election, but there's going to be a lot of debate about this. I mean, it's happening right now over the next few weeks.
Right. Michael's here as always. When we get to talking, we go over time because you're such a fantastic reporter. Washington Post national reporter Michael Scher, thank you for coming back to First Look. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, John.
Time for the Opinions Roundtable. I promise you, it will not be as exciting as last week. So let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find Washington Post Associate Editor Eugene Robinson and Washington Post columnist Megan McCardle. Gene, Megan, welcome back to First Look.
Thank you,
Thanks for having
Jonathan. Don't speak so soon about the drama, though.
I am prepared to bring the excitement. I have some pie recipes, some like crafting tips.
Okay.
Yeah, I've already promised not to stalk out of my own house, so I'm going to. I guess here I am.
Well, thank you. Thank you in advance. I, however, make no promises. So, Gene and Megan, this is a question to both of you, but I'm going to start with you, Megan. From your vantage point, what happened Tuesday night?
Well, I mean, Donald Trump won, looks like the popular vote as well as a strong electoral college majority. That's the obvious answer. Look, I think a lot of things happened here. In some ways, this was overdetermined. For me, the biggest message of this election is that people really, really don't like inflation. I have been writing saying, look, I do think that her far left positions in 2019 hurt her. I do think that immigration, this does not make me happy, but I think that the Democrats are going to have to move substantially right on that. I just think that's the political reality here. But in a lot of ways, this looks like a standard anti-incumbent election. Inflation was high. People don't like it. Kamala Harris, I do think, made a lot of campaign mistakes. That moment on The View that Michael Scher talked about was the biggest one. She did not define herself in an anti-incumbent election. She failed repeatedly to define herself as someone, as a real change candidate who was different from the administration, the unpopular administration she was tied to. And I think that was a big mistake. The campaign was playing like they were a football team with a comfortable lead that just needs to run out the clock in the fourth quarter. And that's not the position that they were in. What they needed to do was take some big risks. They needed to have bold policies that had substantial downside, but also had big upside because the status quo did not benefit them. And I think, unfortunately, one of the things that I have taken away from this, from my few interactions with them, but from also talking to other people who have, is that they were drinking their own Kool-Aid. They were high on their own supply. They were convinced that they were winning this, especially at the end, because the polls were good and because they were actually phenomenally good at message discipline, so good at it that they were cutting off information coming into their campaign that, hey, you're actually in big danger.
And I want to point out, you can read Megan McCardle's column in the actual Washington Post today. You just got a little synopsis of it right there. Gene Robinson, what happened Tuesday night?
Well, again, Donald Trump became was elected the 47th president, and that is to many people like, what? How could this man, after all he has done, be reelected president? And I agree with Megan that there were probably some tactical errors that the Harris campaign made, and I certainly agree that she did not establish herself as change as opposed to status quo. I don't necessarily think we'll look back at this election and say it was tactical mistakes that made, that created this outcome. I am just blown away by the increase in Trump's vote among in states that Harris won. In New Jersey,
New Jersey.
New Jersey, she only won New Jersey by 5 points, which is ridiculous, right? And there are jurisdictions in New Jersey that have gone Democratic. Passaic County, for the last 7 or 8 elections, has gone solid Democratic, heavily Hispanic county, and this time it went for Trump. I do think that Democrats have lost the connection with working class white voters and increasingly Latino voters. 62% of Americans don't have a college degree. 56%, and this is according to the exit polls, and we'll have more refined numbers, but 56% of those who voted who don't have a college degree voted for Donald Trump. There's a connection missing there. Either those voters are not hearing or not liking what the Democrats are saying and doing, and they're going to have to fix that if they want to get back to being a majority party that has a durable majority.
And as you have in the actual today's edition of the Washington Post, you just gave us a synopsis there, but it can be boiled down to Democrats need to focus on upward mobility because of the fact that most of the nation doesn't have a college degree. I also want to put up on the screen something you wrote in a column right after the election, just to put it up there. Ouch, that hurts. The people have spoken, and many of us can't quite process what they said. Donald Trump, despite everything in italics in the paper, will be president again. So I put that out there. So let's talk about the quintessential Washington parlor game, and that is blame. The blame game is off and running. It is in full swing. Former 2020 Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang wrote in Newsweek that Vice President Harris lost because Biden didn't step down earlier. Gene, what do you make of that?
Well, it would have been a very different campaign and a very maybe a different outcome. Who knows if the president had decided to step aside earlier. But by earlier, I think you have to mean like shortly after the 2022 midterm, where Democrats did well. President Biden at that point could have made a decision that he would say, okay, I saved the country from 4 more years of Donald Trump, and I'm gonna step back and hand over to a younger generation and allow for a primary process and stuff. That's not what President Biden decided to do, and there were not a lot of, certainly weren't public calls for him to do so at the time, because at that moment he was kind of riding high. I mean, he had performed, his party had performed historically well in a midterm election that was supposed to see a red wave. Didn't see a red wave. Didn't really even see a pink ripple. It was the Democrats did very well, held the Senate. So he once we got past that point, and there was not a field of Democratic candidates to compete, then we are at that point we were essentially where we were this summer when he did step away, which is there was no process to choose a different nominee or to test a nominee. It was likely going to be Vice President Harris who I thought did a very good job on the campaign, by the way.
Hmm.
I don't think she, think she performed very well. A misstep here and there, maybe, but I thought it was a good campaign.
Yeah, yeah, and so agreed, Gene. Megan, though, what her campaign was only 107 days. Would more time have helped Vice President Harris? Was it a time
Uh,
issue, or focus issue?
Look, honestly, my assessment is that more time would have helped the party to have a primary and maybe pick a different candidate. I think
Mhm.
Kamala Harris, no hit on her. Most people, I would definitely not want to run for president. I would not be a good candidate. She has never displayed the ability to win a tough competitive election. She almost lost to a Republican in California. She's really good at the inside game. I'm not saying she isn't good at her job, but having that it factor that Obama had, that Clinton had, that to some extent George Bush had, although even if you don't like him, of being able to kind of charm voters who aren't already predisposed to like you. I'm sure that many of the audience right now is saying, oh, she is too charismatic. But the thing is, if you're a Democrat, yes, you are very invested in her. But you have to get people who aren't paying close attention to politics, who don't love the candidate the minute they have a D after their name and the nomination's sewed up. And I don't think that she had ever shown the ability to do that. And so I think someone like Gretchen Whitmer, who does have that it factor, has shown her ability to win in a tough swing state with hard elections, with opponents who have a very good chance of Republican opponents who have a very good chance of winning. That might have been a better choice for the party this cycle because they were facing headwinds. But Biden's unfavorabilities were high. A huge proportion of the country was telling pollsters they thought the country was on the wrong track. I just think that was a tough race for anyone. I don't think she did everything she could with those background conditions, but they were tough. And to do that, you kind of need to be a superhero. And I don't think anyone ever thought that Kamala Harris was a superhero candidate. Again, no knock on her as a person, but I just think that's the political reality.
Just to be clear, that
Ma-
tough race she had against a Republican in California, she won.
But
Just
she
to be
did
uh,
clear.
it. But like in California, it shouldn't be close. You shouldn't get
mhm.
that close to losing to a Republican in a state. It's just that is
So,
the
Well,
reality.
just remember
Not everyone at this.
the
mhm.
headwinds she faced in California were the headwinds she faced here. But go ahead, Gene.
No, I was just going to ask a question. I think Megan raises some good and valid points. Would that hypothetical candidate with the it factor have won if he or she were the sitting vice president for a president who had 40% approval ratings? I mean, was it would Barack Obama, in that situation as vice president in an unpopular administration, have been able to pull off this election? Do you think that it factor was the major thing, or was it more structural?
Okay, I think first of all that's a really good question, and that there were a lot of structural and maybe I have to say I think
Yeah, I
Barack
mean,
Obama is a once in a generation political talent, but also that Barack
okay.
Obama would have done what he needed to do. He would have put distance between himself and Biden, even if that broke the personal relationship, even if he felt bad about it. And that in many ways that's the admirable
Mhm.
choice
Yeah.
is to be loyal to your boss. But I think that Obama would have said, look, no, we're not doing this again. It has not worked. I think that's unfortunate. I believed in it. Here's the 5 mistakes I made in thinking about this.
Mhm.
And those were mistakes. And we've learned from that. And here is what I'm going to do going forward. And I think for various reasons, Harris didn't do that. And again, in many ways, it's personally admirable. But I think politically, it was a tough spot. But also, I mean, Barack Obama, once in a generation political talent, maybe no one else
I-
could have done that position, right?
maybe. I mean, I can definitely see how you could distance yourself, even as vice president, a bit more, somewhat more on domestic issues, but on an issue like Gaza, for example, which clearly hurt her in Michigan and elsewhere. Um, you can't have the United States can't have two policies on Gaza, right? So you can't have the
Right. That is
president enunciating one policy and the vice president enunciating another. You can't do that. So
No, I think that's totally fair. I'm not saying he could have done it. I just think he would have had a better shot.
yeah,
The thing I would actually say about blame here is the big mistake Democrats cannot make is to blame the voters. And I have seen a lot of this going around,
absolutely.
talking about this was about misogyny, it was about racism, it was about, and I think the question you have to ask then is, okay, well, what's your theory of how Democrats, if you think that the public is just irretrievably racist and misogynist, and to be clear, I don't. But if you think that, what election strategies and policies should Democrats adopt to deal with that reality and win elections? And I think that it is a way of avoiding trying to have to do hard stuff. I'm not saying that those things play no role, although I will note that both of the female candidates we've had have had somewhat unusual paths to the nominations, where they were not, those kind of politicians who have come up by winning really tough elections. And especially Harris, who didn't even, win a primary. And so I'm not sure how much role misogyny is actually playing. I'm not sure. I certainly hope that the lesson that Democrats take is not, we should not nominate women again. And we had a 2-term Black president. So I don't think that those things are determinative. Don't blame the voters. You can't fix the voters, even if they are irretrievably bad. You can't fix them. What you can do is fix the party.
Gee, I hear everything that you're saying, Megan, and I'm trying to appeal to my better angels in not having bad thoughts about the voters. But Gene, can we ignore the role of race and gender in this campaign? Does that do anyone any good to pretend that wasn't possibly playing a role here, especially given the rhetoric from the Republican ticket that dabbled in racism, sexism, misogyny?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, yes, I think race and gender played a role. I think racism and misogyny played a role. I don't think they. I can't quantify that. And it may have been a minor role, but if it weren't, if Trump and his and other Republicans, frankly, didn't think that they wouldn't have sort of played around with those tropes as much during the campaign, which they did. Now, that said, Megan is absolutely right. You can't change the electorate. Just sitting there and blaming the voters and saying, it's your fault and you are all unworthy of us for having voted for Donald Trump. That is not a recipe for winning elections. If you want to save the country, that's not a recipe for saving the country. And again, what strikes me about this election, the results as far as we know them, is that the loss of that connection between the Democratic Party and white and increasingly Latino working class voters, working class America, blue collar America, that used to be the Democrats' wheelhouse. Donald Trump has perhaps a generational talent for talking to those voters and for making them believe he is on their side. He sees them, he hears them, and Vice President Harris did not have that talent. The Democratic Party right now does not have that talent. There's some people. There's some governors, for example, who are who have shown that they can do that. But that really, rather than the blame game, that's what I would focus on if I were a Democratic operative or official. I would say, where do we go wrong? We've lost too much of the country here. There's no guarantee we're just going to get them back through
And
by having a more charismatic candidate the next time. We've got to talk to these people and connect with them.
and if I could just be clear, I'm not saying that race and gender played no role here. I don't know how big a role they played. I'm sure there is some voter out there who is voting on that. How many of them there are, I don't know. I just think, and obviously we should not pretend that things that are true aren't true. But at the same time, there is a way in which I watched this with Hillary Clinton, who I thought was, for a lot of reasons, a weak candidate. Again, I think she would have been a better president as a candidate. She didn't like speaking in public. It was clear. I remember watching this video of her at the convention, and she was warm and fun, and I wanted to vote for that person. And then she got up and gave her convention speech, and it was a much more stiff, wooden person. She just didn't like crowds, and that's, unfortunately, I think it's kind of a stupid way to choose presidents, but that's what we have.
Right.
And I think there was a lot of aftermath of saying, well, when I would point this out during the campaign, people would be like, you're just saying that because she's a woman. And that was not helpful. It was a way of not engaging with an actual problem, which, by the way, exactly the same problem Andrew Cuomo had, and he wasn't going to be president either. And so I just think it's not that we shouldn't confront things that are true. It is that we should not use them as excuses to avoid confronting other things that are true that make it difficult. I think Donald Trump does play with race. It's terrible. But I think one thing that people should think about is that there is a difference between, in my judgment, not finding that disqualifying. I disagree with that. I think it's disqualifying, the way he uses racially coded language, the way he denied the election. I think a lot of things are disqualifying, right? But there is, in fact, a difference between not thinking those things are disqualifying and caring about something else more, and actually affirmatively voting for him because of those things. And I think often Democrats have, understandably, they feel like, I care so much about this. If they are voting for him, it's because they hate the thing I love, which is racial justice. And I don't think that that's right. I think it's that people are just voting on something else. And I think that they shouldn't, but they did, and we should understand that.
Okay, I was giving some time just in case Gene was going to jump in.
Sorry.
We've got 2 minutes.
Well, no, Megan, I'm not going to, I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree with that. I just think, and neither of us can quantify the role that this played. There was a period of the campaign where the kind of slogan was, she's a DEI candidate, that sort of thing. And I heard people I correspond with. I correspond with some Republicans who really, really disagree with what I write, but who do so politely. But I was surprised when they kind of picked up on that, and so maybe they meant something different from what I think they meant, but I'm pretty sure I know what they meant. And but anyhow, it's I think we would both agree, I think, I don't think that's the main reason she lost. I mean, I think when you look at the results of the election writ large, again, I think the Democratic Party has, I don't think it has the future it wants to have if it is only the party of the college educated, the urban, it's all the stereotypes that frankly describe the three of us. And so if we're the only people that the Democratic Party can speak to and who hear what it's saying, then I don't think the Democratic Party is going to do very well.
We're going to go a little bit. And Megan said, I agree with you on that.
I all agree on that we are great, but we are not an electoral majority.
Well,
No, we're not. We're not.
that is
Damn
correct.
it.
Seriously, Gene. Okay, so we're gonna go overtime, but just a little overtime because we have to talk about Congress. But I'm gonna keep it up at the 40,000-foot level. Republicans won control of the Senate. They're up to now. I think the Senate majority will be 53 seats. Also, Republicans are very close to maintaining their majority in the House. We will find out once the races are decided in California. Real quickly, I'll start with you, Megan. If Republicans take the House, hold on to the House, in addition to taking the Senate and the White House, can they legitimately argue, Republicans, that they have a mandate, that the voters have given them a mandate?
I think they can. I think they would be wise to remember how thin that mandate is in many ways. Look, voters really, really hate inflation, but a lot of the stuff that Trump wants to do is going to be inflationary or kind of pseudo-inflationary. Tariffs do not technically cause inflation, but to the voters who have to pay more for imported goods, that is a distinction without a difference. They will feel it in their pocketbooks and voters will be unhappy and they can lose that mandate as soon as they got it. I have been telling Republicans, look, you know, you guys gloat, it's part of the long American tradition of the post-American, but just remember, you've got a terrible tax fight coming next year. You can't run deficits like you did because that will produce inflation this time. We are not in zero interest rate world. And you do not have a mandate to go after all of your enemies in the way that you want this election to be about all the things you political junkie are mad about, like wokeness or whatever that is. This election is about the fact that people are mad that things cost more, that real wages are not back up to where they were in 2019. And if you misinterpret that as a mandate for some grand ideological project, you are going to lose that mandate as quickly as it came.
Gene, last word to you.
No, I'd say amen. I mean, and I will predict, predicting is hard, especially about the future, as Yogi Berra said. But no, they're going to see it as a mandate. They're going to, reach. They're going to overreach because it's not the kind of mandate they think it is, and because that's what always happens. So absolutely wait for it. It's coming.
Gene Robinson, Megan McCardle, thank you for coming back to First Look and for not leaving mid-show. Thank you both for coming back to First Look. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us. For more of these important conversations, sign up for a Washington Post subscription by going to washingtonpost.com/live. Again, that's washingtonpost.com/live. I'm Jonathan Capehart. Thank you for watching Washington Post Live's First Look.